my father's hometown is located about just under 2 hours away from our house by car. It's a farming village, but I've always loved the atmosphere there. When I started riding a motorcycle in high school, I often went there alone during summer and winter vacations. My grandparents were always happy to see me, saying, "Thank you for coming." However, the last time I went there was right before my senior year of high school, which means I haven't been there for more than 10 years. It's not that I didn't go, but rather I couldn't go, and here's why. It was just the beginning of spring break, and the beautiful weather enticed me to ride my motorcycle to my grandfather's house. It was still cold, but the veranda felt warm and cozy, so I relaxed there for a while. Then I heard a strange sound. Popo, papa popo, paw, pop. It didn't sound mechanical, it felt more like a person making the noise. The sound seemed to fall somewhere between voiced and unvoiced consonants. As I wondered what it could be, I spotted a hat on top of the hedge in the garden. It wasn't just placed on the hedge, the hat moved sideways until it reached a gap in the hedge, revealing a woman. Well, the hat was worn by that woman. She was wearing a pale-colored one-piece dress. However, the hedge was about 2 meters high. How tall must the woman be to stick her head out from above the hedge like that? As I stood there, astonished, the woman moved again and disappeared from sight. The hat was gone too. And before I knew it, the popo, popo sound had also vanished. At that time, I only thought that either it was a naturally tall woman wearing extremely thick soled boots, or a tall man in high heels dressed as a woman. Afterwards, while having tea in the living room, I told my grandparents about what I had seen earlier. I saw a really tall woman just now. I wonder if it was a man dressed as a woman, I said. They didn't seem too interested, just responding with a casual However, when I mentioned, she was taller than the hedge, wearing a hat, and making strange noises like popo, popo, their movements suddenly stopped. I mean, they really stopped dead in their tracks. After that, my grandfather, with a somewhat angry expression, bombarded me with questions. When did you see her, where did you see her, and how much taller was she than the hedge? As I answered his questions, feeling a little overwhelmed by his intensity, he suddenly fell silent, walked to the telephone in the hallway, and started making a call to someone. Because the sliding door was closed, I couldn't quite make out what he was saying. My grandmother seemed to be shivering slightly, as if she was worried. My grandfather came back after finishing the phone call and said, "Stay here tonight." "No, I can't let you go home today." I desperately tried to think if I had done something terribly wrong, but nothing came to mind. After all, it wasn't like I went out of my way to see that woman, she appeared on her own. Then, he left a message for my grandmother. "I'm leaving it to you, Grandma. I'm going to pick up Mr. K," and went somewhere in his light truck. When I timidly asked my grandmother about it, she replied with a trembling voice, "It seems you've been enchanted by the Hachishaku-sama. Your grandfather will do something about it. You don't have to worry about anything." Until my grandfather returned, my grandmother spoke to me in bits and pieces. In this area, there is a troublesome entity called Hachishaku-sama. Hachishaku-sama appears as a large woman, about 8 shaku, approximately 2.4 meters tall as the name suggests, and laughs with a strange, masculine babobo sound. People see her differently. Some see her as a young woman in mourning clothes, others as an old woman in a formal kimono, and still others as a middle-aged woman in work clothes. However, all descriptions have her as a tall female figure wearing something on her head and having a creepy laugh. There are rumors that she once attached herself to a traveler long ago, but no one knows for sure. This being was sealed by a Jizo statue in this district, now part of city, but formerly Times Village, equivalent to the current Oasa classification, and it cannot go elsewhere. If someone is enchanted by Hachishaku-sama, they will be killed within a few days. The last victim of Hachishaku-sama was about 15 years ago. I learned later that the reason Hachishaku-sama was sealed by the Jizo statue is that her ability to move to other places is limited for some unknown reason. The village boundaries along her path were enshrined with Jizo statues. There are 4 such Jizo statues in total, one for each of the east, west, north, and south boundaries. These are meant to prevent Hachishaku-sama from moving about. Moreover, it seems that the surrounding villages had some sort of agreement to keep such an entity. For example, they might prioritize water rights. Since incidents involving Hachishaku-sama only occur every few to 10 years, perhaps the people of the past thought it was acceptable as long as they could establish a reasonably advantageous agreement. Even after hearing all that, I couldn't really believe it. Of course, I couldn't. Eventually, my grandfather returned with an old woman. "You've gotten yourself into quite a situation. For now, take this," the old woman named Keisan said, handing me a talisman. Then she went upstairs with my grandfather, and they did something up there. My grandmother stayed with me the whole time, even accompanying me to the bathroom and not letting me close the door completely. It was then that I started to think, maybe this is really serious. After a while, I was taken to a room on the second floor. All the windows were covered with newspapers, and talismans were placed on top of them. In the four corners of the room, there were piles of salt. There was also a wooden box-like object, not something that could be called an altar, and on top of it was a small Buddha statue. Furthermore, there were 2 chamber pots prepared, as if telling me to use them for my needs. It's almost sunset. Listen, you cannot leave this room until tomorrow morning. Your grandmother and I won't call for you or talk to you either. Let's see, don't leave this room until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. When it's 7 o'clock, you can come out. I'll let your family know. My grandfather said this with a serious face, so all I could do was nod silently. Be sure to follow what I just told you. Keep the talisman close to you at all times. If something happens, pray in front of the Buddha statue, Keisan also advised me. Even though I was told it was okay to watch TV, I couldn't focus on it, and my mind was elsewhere. I didn't feel like eating the rice balls and snacks my grandmother had given me when I was locked in the room, so I left them untouched and just wrapped myself in the futon, shivering. Despite my state, I must have fallen asleep at some point. When I woke up, there was some late-night program on TV that I couldn't remember, and when I checked my watch, it was past 1 a.m. I didn't have a cell phone at the time. As I was thinking about the unpleasant time I had woken up at, I heard a sound like someone tapping on the window glass. I think it was a sound like someone lightly tapping with their hand, not like someone throwing pebbles at the window. I couldn't tell whether it was the wind making the noise or someone actually tapping, but I desperately tried to convince myself that it was the wind. I took a sip of tea to calm down, but I was still scared, so I turned up the TV volume and forced myself to watch it. At that moment, I heard my grandfather's voice. "Hey, are you okay? You don't have to force yourself if you're scared." I instinctively moved closer to the door, but then I immediately remembered what my grandfather had said. I heard the voice again. "What's wrong? You can come over here." The voice was incredibly similar to my grandfather's, but it wasn't his. I didn't know why, but I had a feeling it wasn't, and as soon as I thought that, goosebumps covered my entire body. Suddenly, I looked at the pile of salt in the corner, and the top of it had turned black. I hurriedly sat down in front of the Buddha statue, tightly gripping the talisman and desperately praying, "Please help me." At that moment, "Pa-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa." I heard that voice, and the window glass started to make a tapping sound. I knew it wasn't that tall, but I couldn't help but picture it reaching up from below and tapping on the window glass. All I could do was pray to the Buddha statue. It felt like an incredibly long night, but morning still came. At some point, the TV that had been left on was showing the morning news. The time displayed in the corner of the screen was 7:13 a.m. The tapping on the glass and that voice had stopped without me noticing. It seems that I had either fallen asleep or passed out. The pile of salt had turned even blacker. Just to be sure, I checked my own watch, and the time was almost the same. With trepidation, I opened the door, and there were my grandmother and Ms. K, both looking worried. My grandmother cried tears of relief, saying, "Thank goodness, thank goodness." When I went downstairs, I saw that my father had also arrived. My grandfather poked his head out from outside and urged me to get in the car quickly. When I went out into the garden, there was a one-box van parked there, and I wondered where it had come from. There were also several men in the garden. The one-box van could seat 9 people, and I was seated in the middle of the middle row. Ms. K sat in the passenger seat, and all the men from the garden also got in the van. There were 9 of us in total, surrounded on all sides. It's a serious situation. You might be curious, but from now on, keep your eyes closed and look down. We can't see anything, but you might be able to see it. Don't open your eyes until I say it's okay, said a man in his 50s sitting to my right. Then, with my grandfather driving the lead truck, followed by the van I was in, and my father driving a passenger car at the rear, we set off in a convoy. The vehicles moved at a very slow speed, probably not even reaching 20 kilometers per hour. Soon after, Ms. K murmured, "This is where we have to hold our ground," and began chanting something like a Buddhist prayer. Pa-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa. I heard that voice again. I clenched the talisman I received from Ms. K, closed my eyes as I was told, and looked down, but for some reason, I slightly opened my eyes and caught a glimpse of the outside. What I saw was a whitish one-piece dress, moving in sync with the car. Was it following us with those long strides? Its head was outside the window and not visible. However, it seemed to start lowering its head, as if trying to peek inside the car. Unconsciously, I let out a small gasp. "Don't look," the man beside me raised his voice. In a panic, I tightly closed my eyes and gripped the talisman even harder. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of the glass being tapped began. The people around me let out short exclamations like "ah" and "mm." It seemed that even if they couldn't see it or hear its voice, they could still hear the sound. Ms. K's chanting intensified. Eventually, when I thought the voice and sound had stopped, Ms. K exclaimed, "We've successfully escaped it." The men surrounding us, who had been silent until then, also let out sighs of relief. Soon, the car stopped at a wider part of the road, and I was transferred to my father's car. As my father and grandfather bowed their heads to the other men, Ms. K approached me and said, "Show me the talisman." When I looked at the talisman I had unconsciously been gripping, it had turned blackish. Ms. K gave me a new talisman, saying, "I think it's safe now, but keep this with you for a while just in case." After that, my father and I returned home. My grandfather and some neighbors delivered my bike a few days later. It seemed that my father also knew about the Hachishaku-sama, and he told me that one of his friends had been possessed by it as a child and lost their life. He also knew people who had moved away because they had been entranced by it. The men in the van were all related to my grandfather's family, meaning they were all, albeit very distantly, related to me by blood. My grandfather, who drove ahead, and my father, who drove behind, were of course blood-related, and they had arranged such a plan to deceive Hachishaku-sama's eyes as much as possible. My father's brother, my uncle, couldn't make it here overnight, so they had asked people who, although distantly related, could gather quickly. Even so, it was impossible to gather 7 men right away, and it was thought that daytime would be safer than nighttime, so I was confined to my room for one night. During the journey, my grandfather and father were prepared to be substitutes for me if the worst happened. After explaining what had happened, as I mentioned earlier, I was urged not to go there again. When I talked to my grandfather on the phone after returning home, I asked him if he had called out to me that night, but he firmly denied doing so. As I thought, that was. When I thought that, I felt a chill run down my spine again. It is said that Hachishaku-sama's victims are often young people, especially children, before they become adults. When a child or young person is in a state of extreme anxiety, they may inadvertently trust the voice of a family member saying such things. 10 years later, when I had almost forgotten about that incident, a disturbing sequel unfolded. I heard that the Jizo statue that seals Hachishaku-sama was destroyed by someone. Moreover, it's the one on the path leading to your house, my grandmother called to tell me. My grandfather had passed away 2 years ago, and I couldn't attend the funeral, of course. My grandfather had said not to let me come once he became bedridden. Now, while trying to convince myself that it's just a superstition, I can't help but feel worried. When I think about hearing that voice again, the popopo,